Just like a Mongol army out for additional plunder, we've decided to run it back. We're going to continue to talk about what it takes to bring down a medieval city, the ins and outs of unconventional siege tactics, and how you can use them in your games. Hello everyone, I am Kyle and welcome to Desks and Dorks. This is a companion video to the piece that we did on medieval siege tactics and history. If you have not watched that video, I will provide a link to it in the description of this one so that you can see the historical perspective, but today is going to be all about variant rules, monsters, and techniques for your sieges and how they relate to real historical techniques. A couple things, as always, if you really want to help us out, the YouTube pleasantries, liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing, those go a great deal to help support the mission of Desks and Dorks, particularly if you want to use that QR code or the links in the description to purchase some of our games. With that said, a couple disclaimers. I was a Eurocentric medievalist, that's what I was trained in. I will be basing a lot of this on Western Europe, so again, those other time periods, the other places in the world, they're worth interacting with, they are worth engaging with. I just don't feel like I have the nuance and training to represent them properly, and if you're gonna lean on the more horrific elements of a siege, the sacking of a city, for example, you might want to lean on your safety tools. But with that out of the way, let's talk about trick steps, dummy steps, and the murder step. Now, for those of you not in the know, this was a real tactic that was used by medieval architects. You see, one of the ways that you could confuse and discombobulate attackers is by making your steps either vary entirely, which means every single step varied in width, height, and size. This meant that over time, the inhabitants of a castle would get used to the steps by muscle memory, but an attacker who is brand new to a tower would actually be thrown completely out of a loop. That's what a trick step, a dummy step, a murder step is. Or, more insidiously, would be if they didn't all vary, because if they all varied, what happens is the attacker would realize I'm in danger all of the time. But the worst of them were when a staircase was all of uniform length and size, width and size, height, whatever, and one step was wrong, or maybe two steps were wrong. This meant that over time, the muscle memory of the attacker would grow used to the way that the steps functioned, and then all of a sudden, usually at the worst possible moment, or at a place where the defenses were highest, the dummy step, the trick step, the murder step would happen. That is a real thing that did occur in medieval castles, and it got me thinking about how we would incorporate that in fantasy role-playing games. One of the ideas that I had that I think would be really interesting is if you used a percentage chance in your games to slip and fall. This means that, like, those people who have not had time to acclimate to the castle's environment are always at danger of being knocked prone. That's like a tier 1 solution, I think. But I really do find that we could make some better and perhaps more interesting ideas for making a murder step or a trick step work in our sieges, in our fantasy role-playing games. One of the ideas that I had was creating an ever-changing staircase, kind of like the ones in Hogwarts. Right now, you could continue to make that percentage chance that we talked about a little bit earlier, but I think there's some even cooler ways that you could do this. You could, with one of those steps, force the target to maybe fall or plummet to either injury or complete and utter unalivement. You could also have the steps shift, allowing attackers to lose the high ground they thought they had to defenders who would have been on a lower level of the step. This is especially true if the defenders inside the castle have some degree of control over how the steps move and rotate. For those of you wondering how that could work in a fantasy role-playing game, there's two solutions, right? Well, the one is, of course, the magic, but what if you want to make a more low fantasy or grounded fantasy setting? Well, I've actually come up with two solutions to help you with that if you want to incorporate this kind of magic step or this kind of murder step into your own games. The first one I thought about was the Dwarven Crank Tower. So I love the idea of the dwarves using their abilities both for artifice and stonecraft to essentially make a series of winches and interconnected pulleys that will allow them to move the steps of the staircase. I envision this as essentially engineers or combat engineers for the dwarves hiding behind certain sections of the walls with their cranks, and then over time being able to shift the layout of the staircase or maybe even entire towers. It would be a really interesting way to do it. It would take some time, but if you were an attacking army, the idea of having the defenses be completely moved and altered mid-fight would be something that would be really huge. It's not something I even included a game rule for because I think it would totally change the approach of the adventure. I would go so far as to even have several different combat maps for a fortress to reflect how the map and the topography of that battle changes as time goes on. The other one that I was thinking of is there are some early, even pre-industrial patents and schematics for steam-powered elevators or lifts, and it would be really interesting if instead of by using cranks and pulleys and stonecraft, we use the natural power of steam to allow those stone slabs to move, or to allow the murder step to sort of change the way that it works, and thus confuse, or at the very least, make the lives of attackers a little bit more difficult. That's how I would use it in a more low fantasy or a more grounded fantasy setting. But of course, if you really love your high magic, your Harry Potter-esque stuff, just, throw caution to the wind and enjoy it for the time that you've got it. Another thing that I think that you could do is you could, of course, force players to take damage. Maybe they get hit by the steps as they shift, or they get, limbs trapped as the stones shift. It would be potentially terrifying for limb loss, being force prone, having them lose items as they attempt to scramble up one step and down to the other. But again, the sky is the limit, I should say, or the stones are the limit in this case. And being able to sort of alter the topography of a battle, the landscape of a siege, is a defensible trait that I think most real-life medieval tacticians would have sawed their left arm for. Another thing that I think I want to talk about when we're talking about how to implement these ideas into our own games is the use of siege engines. If you watched our earlier companion video, you'll know that the trebuchet and the catapult were king when it came to these sieges. But one of the things that we didn't talk about the last time was the asymmetric nature of their ammunition. You see, trebuchets and catapults didn't always hurl stones. Sometimes they hurled things like, deceased friends and allies of the people inside the city, or sick animals in an attempt to spread disease or to crush morale. And I really wanted to sort of narrow in on how they would have crushed morale and how they would have spread illness in order to impact the defenders. One of the things that I think you could potentially do is a nightmare lobber. Imagine an arcane trebuchet or an arcane catapult that hurls magic shadow capsules, and then once those explode overhead, they plunge the defenders not into a sleep. That would be too easy. The wizard, the artificer, whoever is in charge of making this ammunition, right, has it so that people think there's no effect until the night comes, at which point these horrific night terrors begin to assail the people sleeping inside the keep or the fortress, and thus rendering them not just unable to rest, but because they're unable to rest, they're less effective in combat, less vigilant on watch, and at more risk of being overcome and defeated when the final attack comes. I think it's really interesting and would make for a fantastic horror-themed game if you had the players inside of the siege when it happened, have them not make any rolls, have them just suffer no ill consequences from being exposed to this ammunition, and then wait until nightfall to spring this horrific trap on them. And I think you could really amp the horror up if you just let it go a few days. Let the players realize how exhausted they're growing, how strung out all of the defenders are becoming, and how really, truly terrible it's becoming, because those hallucinations, if you research sleep deprivation, that comes into play even during your waking hours. This is a truly horrific way to not just affect the morale, but the psyche of the defenders of this castle. I think it's a really interesting concept. The other thing that you could do if you wanted a more low fantasy approach is you could do what some Chinese tacticians actually did during the medieval era, and you could just deafen defenders and blind them with an overwhelming show of fireworks or things like that. One of the things you could do to, actually disengage your enemy or demoralize your enemy is use bright, loud, flashy things. This has the effect of course, if you've ever, lived in the United States during the 4th of July, you know how difficult it can be to sleep it through a fireworks display. Imagine that constantly. Now, there is an exorbitant cost to that if you are the attacker, but again, if you really want the fortress, who cares? Your enemy is not going to be able to sleep. They'll be either deafened from the noise, maybe even partially blinded, or at least have their night vision affected by the constant barrage of fireworks, and you have the added impact of even frightening the animals inside of the village, the keep, the castle, whatever. That's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to engage in a counterattack or even just to sleep. If you have an enemy who has a wealth of both ammunition and just a wealth of material goods that they can funnel into these firework type weapons, this is something you could use, and it does have some basis and some precedent in history. Fireworks were used by the Chinese at a number of different times, but bright lights and loud noises were used to frighten things like elephants and cavalry, going as far back as in antiquity in the battles of ancient Rome and Carthage. Something to take in mind, and something for you to keep in mind when you're planning your sieges. But one of the things that I think is a crazy demoralization tactic is if you have the trebuchets throw and waste water or throw spoiled food into a starving fortress, a starving keep. This actually does happen a couple times in human history, where the attacker, or even in some cases the defender, looking out at the starving army that's attempting to quote unquote besiege them, wastes valuable supplies in an effort to demoralize their opponents. It's a crazy psychological feat, but it does have a lasting impact. Imagine you are on day 16, day 32, day, 106 of a siege. Supplies are dwindling, hope is running out, and you watch as the enemy catapults don't even bother to lob ammunition. They lob tanks of water at you. Watching those water tanks dissipate onto the cobblestone floor of your keep or smash into the walls of your keep when your people are literally dying of thirst is a crazy amount of demoralization and psychological warfare, and it would have been incredibly effective if you knew what was going on and you knew the starving state of your opponents. I think it's a really interesting technique, and one again that has some precedent in real historical warfare. But what about disease? What about miasma? What about early biological warfare? We have a couple instances, not many, but a couple, of medieval siege engines hurling sick or diseased animals in an attempt to spread sickness in a medieval settlement, walled city, castle, etc. Now, we don't know the effectiveness of this in general. It seems that the effectiveness of this technique was dubious at best. We don't have, obviously many techniques or tactics or, firsthand accounts describing what happens in this, an outbreak from a diseased cattle barrage, so to speak. But again, I love this idea as a potential inspiration for our tabletop role-playing games. There's a couple ways that you could go about this. You could allow your opponents to throw in diseased or dead livestock, but one of the ones that I think is really interesting is using the biological and the microscopic. You see, it is entirely possible for you to inundate a settlement with fleas or ticks. And in fact, by the way, this is a flea rearing device. This is actually a way that science labs breed fleas, which I didn't even realize was a thing that you could do. But it would be really terrifying if this gets lobbed at the castle, right? The outer shell of this cage is designed to break, and you don't care if the host dies because the fleas will most likely survive. And when they do, there will be plenty of available hosts inside the castle or the defensible position. Now, you can go in this with a more magical bent. I like this one. This is called Targon's fleas. These would grow in size and ferocity, strength of the disease that they spread, the more they consume, eventually growing to the size of house cats, trying to incredibly aggressive. Think like face huggers mixed with a parasite. Again, usually the enemy force, if they've resorted to using Targon's fleas, the fortress is going to be razed to the ground at a safe distance. This is just a must get rid of everybody panic button if you're trying to take a defensible position. However, I actually don't even think you have to go full magic with this, because medieval fleas had all manner of horrific things that they carried with them. The Black Plague, the bubonic plague, was not started by rats, as most people commonly thought, but by fleas and the bloodborne illnesses that they carried. And again, things like fatigue, organ failure, unalignment, a host of issues. By the way, if you're looking at this image, this is a medieval depiction of fleas, which I thought was so interesting, because I looked at it and I was like, oh, those are really big, but I still got that weird skin crawly sort of sensation looking at that bed sheet. And I was like, this is a fantastic image. I have to put this in. But realistically, you don't have to destroy the inhabitants of a castle, of a keep, of a fortress to take it. You really, truly have to demoralize and destabilize them in order to actually succeed. I thought that was pretty interesting and intriguing, but I didn't want to just leave our defenders out. If you wanted some options for using and defending a keep or a castle, now burning oil gets a lot of attention in Hollywood. Burning oil was used in some cases. However, it's far less common than Hollywood would have us believe. Obviously, it makes sense that burning oil would be involved. It's flashy, it's bright, it certainly looks great on screen. All you have to do is look at the Siege of Notre Dame, for example, and Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Disney movie, to watch what that boiling molten substance being poured out onto the streets, onto attackers, looks like. But historically, burning oil didn't see a whole lot of use. Still, I liked the concept, and I thought there was some fun ways that we could fantasize or make it a fantasy concept. The one that I really thought of were these specialized ooze cauldrons. Imagine for a moment that instead of regular cauldrons of, sick water or waste, which actually was much more commonly used, why would you waste precious oil when you can just dump human excrement on the attackers? It has pretty much the same effect, truth be told. The attacker's not going to have a good day, and it doesn't cost you anything. Oil you would have had a chance to use or needed to use for a number of different things. But I love the idea of maybe specialized ooze capsules. Imagine having the defenders sort of pour this container out, and instead of dealing with, something you could wipe off and, maybe get sick from or get burned from, something that literally starts to cling to your siege ladder, that starts to jump from attacker to attacker and slowly eats its way down into your ranks. I thought that would be particularly horrifying. But one really interesting take would be, what if we had a special type of ooze that instead of consuming, teleports them away, right? Imagine being poured into this multifaceted, multi-prismatic liquid, and it just sort of covers and congeals over your friends, and all of a sudden they're gone. They disappear. Imagine the demoralization. Imagine the effect to morale that would have on an attacking force. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what kind of setting would have ooze cauldrons on standby? Well, think about it this way. I envision a place kind of like Zaun, maybe, from Arcane, if you really like it. But imagine a fortress that has a lot of arcane runoff from its alchemical labs and from its experimentation, and rather than waste that waste substance, they repurpose it into defensive ammunition for their fortifications. Those are just a few things that you can do to make your sieges a little more historically connected, but also a little more fantastically based. And with that brings us to the end of our video today. If you have enjoyed your time with us, again, I really would appreciate all of the YouTube pleasantries. Again, the best way to support us is purchasing our games anywhere in the links in the description below. But if you've stuck it out this long, I just have to say thank you all so much for joining us here at Desks and Dorks. I'm Kyle Ott. I'm the Dork. You've been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.